The Penderwicks, A Summer Tale of Four Sisters, Two Rabbits, A Very Interesting Boy, by Jeanne Birdsall. Chapter 10, A Bold Escape. The day after his birthday party, Geoffrey showed up at the cottage ready for soccer practice, as though nothing had changed from the day before. But something had changed, everyone knew it. Now Geoffrey had the double threat of Dexter and Pensy hanging over his head, without knowing which was going to happen, or when. It didn't make it any easier that the Penderwicks' time at Arundel was more than half gone. In a week and a few days, they would be heading back to Cameron. Without knowing Geoffrey's fate, maybe never to see him again, it was unthinkable. Then, too, there was the problem of Mrs. Tifton all of a sudden being everywhere. It was the upcoming gardening club competition, Geoffrey said. His mother was obsessed with Arundel when waiting for his prize, and so was spending all her time outside, bussing over details and driving Cagney nuts. And driving the children nuts, too. If they were kicking soccer balls at the Marble Thunderbolt man, he made a good goaltender. Mrs. Tifton showed up to scold. If they were taking bets on how high the lily pond frogs could jump, she said they were bothering the frogs. If they were cooling off in the shade of a rose arbor, she told them, well, anything it seemed, just to keep them moving along. It was bad for everyone, but it was hardest on Batty, for while the three older Penderwicks loathed Mrs. Tifton, Batty feared her. As she told Hound when they were alone at night, Mrs. Tifton was the meanest person she had ever met. So mean, said Batty, that the flowers died when she walked by, which wasn't true, but Hound knew just what she meant. And so Batty did everything she could to avoid Mrs. Tifton, and generally succeeded by hiding behind a bush or a sister. But there was one occasion when Mrs. Tifton caught Batty all by herself, and the consequences were dreadful. It all started one morning a few days after the birthday party. "Please, Rosalind," said Batty. She was clutching 2 fat carrots. "I already told you, Batty, I'll take you to see the rabbits later, but not now." Rosalind was simultaneously baking brownies and reading a book about Civil War generals. Cagney had lent her the book, and she wanted to be able to say something intelligent about Ulysses S. Grant and Appomattox the next time she saw him. Batty cared nothing for Grant and Appomattox. Cagney says the bunnies expect me in the mornings now. By later, they'll already think I've abandoned them. They'll think I've abandoned them. I'm right in the middle of making these brownies, and then I have to finish my letter to Anna, so Daddy can mail it for me when he goes into town, said Rosalind. So it's either later or not at all. You've seen the rabbits every morning for a week and a half now. You can skip one day. No, I can't. Honey, I'm sorry. Why don't you ask Jane or Sky to go with you? 'Cause they'll say no. Ask them. If they won't, I promise we'll go later, okay? Batty carried her carrots out to the front yard where Jane and Sky were painting a face on a big round piece of cardboard. The face had a smirk and a big mustache, and in case that wasn't enough of a hint, the initials D.D. were painted across the bottom. "Jane, Rosalind says she can't take me to see Yaz and Carla, and will you?" "Sorry," said Jane. Cagney figured out how to put rubber tips on those arrows, and Geoffrey's bringing them over so he can do target practice. "Can't you ask Daddy?" "He's out collecting plants," said Batty. She looked at Sky with no hope. "Forget it, midget," said Sky. Batty gloomily wandered into the backyard and over to Hound's pen, where Hound was sleeping on his back with his legs sticking up in the air. Maybe she should just go by herself. Batty leaned against the fence and pondered the idea. Stay in the yard. That was always the rule. But no one had ever said where the yard for the cottage actually ended. She could ask Rosalind if maybe the yard stretched all the way to where the rabbits lived. Or she could go see the rabbits first and ask Rosalind later. Which she would ask Hound. "Hound, wake up," said Batty, but he only grumbled and fell over onto his side. That was a good enough answer for Batty. She looked around to make sure no one was watching, then took off for the hedge. "Be quick like a bunny," she said to herself as she popped through Geoffrey's gap and across the gardens, with only a brief detour to the lily pond to visit the frogs, then to the carriage house and Cagney's door. Panting, but triumphant, and still unobserved, Batty knocked. Cagney wasn't home, but that was all right. Often he wasn't, and Batty knew exactly what to do, for he had explained it all to her and Rosalind. Call out to Yaz and Carla, open the door and slide the carrots inside. Then you can watch through the screen as they eat the carrots. But never forget the most important part, Cagney had said. You must latch the door securely again, because if you don't, Yaz will shove it open with his nose and run away, and he can't survive outside. A fox would kill him, or a hawk, or an eagle. Then Carla would wither away and die of loneliness, because they're best friends and love each other very much. Patty pressed her face to the screen and peered in. Yaz and Carla were asleep on the rug, side by side, their noses touching. "Wake up!" called Patty softly. Carla flipped one ear in her direction, then Yaz did, and a minute later they were both yawning and stretching and doing their wake-up dance, running around in a circle, jumping and changing direction midair, then running around in a circle the other way. Patty carefully unlatched the screen door and shoved her 2 carrots inside. Though she knew she shouldn't, she also stuck her nose inside, just in case Yaz wanted to come over and rub noses. This was her downfall, for while her nose was still inside, she heard a familiar and dreaded sound behind her on the brick path that led to Cagney's door. Tap, 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 tap. Panicked, Patty whirled around to face her enemy and discovered that the situation was even worse than she had thought, for it wasn't just Mrs. Tifton. Dexter was there too. The carrots were forgotten, the rabbits were forgotten, and Cagney's most important rule about latching the screen door was forgotten. "Good grief, Dexter, here's one of the Penderwicks," said Mrs. Tifton. "Run along back to the cottage, Biddy, or whatever your name is. Your father didn't rent the whole estate, you know." Patty felt as helpless as a fly in spider web. She would have liked more than anything to run along to the cottage, but getting past those 2 grown-ups was impossible. "Why doesn't she say anything?" said Mrs. Tifton. "She didn't speak at Jeffrey's party either. Did you notice that? Maybe something's wrong with her." Dexter tapped the side of his head significantly. "Or she could be deaf." Mrs. Tifton leaned toward Patty. "Can you hear me?" Patty didn't mind being thought deaf, but she was annoyed that Dexter didn't think she would understand what his head tapping was all about. She knew that meant crazy, even if she was only 4. "Not crazy," she thought, "you mean old silly man." And she concentrated all her attention on wishing Dexter's mustache would turn green or orange or fall off his face and onto the ground right there and then. Which is why she didn't notice that behind her, the screen door was slowly being pushed open. It wasn't until it bonked into Patty's back that finally, too late, she remembered about Yaz and his tendency to escape, letting out a yell, a kind of garbled combination of Yaz and "Yaz, no!" She threw herself against the door, relatching it, but Yaz was already through. There was a brush of fur against Patty's ankle, a streak of brown down the path and across the driveway, and he disappeared into the gardens. The adults had noticed nothing but Patty's cry. Mrs. Tifton straightened up, not pleased. "Yaz, no. When she does talk, she doesn't make any sense." "Like I said," Dexter tapped his head again. "Maybe you're right. Another reason to be glad her family's leaving soon. 7 days and counting." She put her arm through Dexter's. "Come along, our Cagney must be somewhere else." And away they strolled. Patty was in shock. She had done everything wrong. All of that about the yard stretching to where the rabbits lived, and maybe she could go by herself. Wrong, wrong, wrong. She had disobeyed Rosalind. She had disobeyed Cagney. And she had annoyed Mrs. Tifton. But worst of all, it wasn't she who was being punished for it. It was Yaz and Carla, who would soon both be dead because of Patty's wickedness. Wicked, wicked Patty. She couldn't go back to Rosalind now. There was only one thing to do. Find Yaz and bring him home. By the time Rosalind finished her letter to Anna, the brownies were done. She took them out of the oven and let them cool, cut them into squares, and neatly wrapped 4 of the squares in tin foil. These were for Cagney. Just the other morning, while watering the Fimbriata rosebush, he told Rosalind how much he liked brownies. He said they were just about his favorite food, brownies and the hot dogs you get at Fenway Park. Not that she had made the brownies for Cagney, she told herself while sticking a cheerful yellow bow onto the tinfoil. As she had written to Anna, she would never sink so low as to try to get a boy's attention with food, or with Civil War knowledge. Brownies also happened to be her father's favorite snack, and the Civil War truly was fascinating, though she never realized it before. Patty hadn't come back inside since leaving with the carrots. Rosalind figured she'd either convinced Jane to take her to visit Yaz and Carla, or she'd started playing and forgotten all about them. Rosalind considered looking for Patty before taking the brownies to Cagney's apartment, just in case she still wanted to go. But no, Rosalind decided, with only a tiny twinge of guilt. Cagney might be there, and it was more fun to see him without little sisters around. Though she didn't know it, Rosalind took the same route Patty had earlier, even including the detour to the lily pond. Rosalind loved this pond. She found it peaceful, but a little sad too. For some reason, it always made her think of Hamlet's girlfriend, Ophelia, and how she drowned herself when she went insane. Or maybe it was when Hamlet went insane. Rosalind wasn't sure which, and Anna said it was Rosalind who was insane to be reading Shakespeare. But Rosalind's mother had loved his plays and always quoted him, like, "I pray thee, Rosalind, sweet my daughter, be merry." Her mother must have said it to her 1,000 times. Lately, Rosalind had been thinking about her mother even more often than usual, and wondering whether or not she would like Cagney. Though, how anyone could not like Cagney was beyond Rosalind's power of imagination. He's probably perfect, she thought, and leaning over the edge of the pond, picked a lily and tucked it behind her ear. She set off again for the carriage house, still not directly, for the sisters had learned the best routes for avoiding Mrs. Tifton. This one took her around the pond, up past the old spring house, down through the lilac walk, and her luck ran out. She was face to face with Mrs. Tifton and Dexter. "This is too much, really too much," said Mrs. Tifton. "Penderwicks everywhere like a swarm of locusts. And who gave you permission to pick one of my lilies?" Rosalind clapped her hand over the flower, mortified. "No one, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "That's right, you shouldn't have, like you shouldn't be here with my gardens. I'm getting very tired of running into your family." "I'm sorry," said Rosalind again. "I was just going to leave Cagney some brownies." "The way to a man's heart, etc., etc.," said Mrs. Tifton. "Remind me to bake for you sometime, Dexter." "You already have my heart, darling." "Yes, well, of course." She patted her hair complacently. "So, Rosalind, you may leave your little offering at the carriage house, but if you're hoping to see Cagney, I sent him out to buy mulch. Then hurry back to your own side of the hedge, and if your youngest sister's still hanging around, take her with you." "Batty?" "Bitty Batty, the one with the wings." Dexter made the wings sound extremely ill-bred and tacky. Rosalind's stomach took a plunge. You saw Batty at the carriage house?" "That's what I said, isn't it?" said Mrs. Tifton. "Now run along." Rosalind slid past them, not knowing whether she was more upset by Mrs. Tifton's nasty comments or about Batty being at the carriage house. Had Batty really decided to go see the rabbits all by herself? She knew she wasn't allowed to wander around alone like that. Rosalind dashed toward Cagney's apartment, the lily dropping unheeded from her hair. When she arrived, there was no sign of Batty. But had she been there earlier? Rosalind peered through the screen door, but what she saw did not calm her. There were 2 fat carrots on the rug right inside the door. That wasn't right. Yaz never let carrots lie around uneaten. "Rabbits!" called Rosalind. Nothing. She called again, and this time one nose came poking out from under the couch. It was Carla. She gave Rosalind a long, sad gaze, then pulled back and disappeared. What had Batty done? At about the same time that Rosalind was picking the lily, Jeanne was aiming an arrow at the cardboard target of Dexter's face, now nailed to a tree. She let the arrow fly. "That's the 3rd time you've missed the whole target. Are you blind?" said Skye. "Take off your hat, Jeanne," said Geoffrey. Jeanne was wearing a yellow rain hat because Skye and Geoffrey were wearing their camouflage hats, and she didn't want to be the only one without a hat. But it wasn't the hat that made her miss the target. She could see perfectly. It was the lack of concentration. She was too busy trying to figure out how to get bows and arrows into her Sabrina Star book. She strung a 4th arrow. Maybe she could use them in the hot air balloon scene. Sabrina could shoot an arrow at Arthur's window with a message tied to it. No, she had already used carrier pigeons to take messages back and forth. Wait, here was an idea. Sabrina could tie one end of a rope to an arrow and the other end to the balloon basket, then shoot the arrow through Arthur's window. Arthur could then use the rope to haul the balloon close enough that he could climb out the window onto the tree branch and into the balloon basket. That was perfect. She pulled the string of the bow again and shot the arrow. Thwonk. "Bullseye!" shouted Jeanne. "First strike for Jeanne," said Geoffrey. "That wasn't a bullseye," said Jeanne. "You won't disable Dexter with a glancing blow to the cheekbone." She walked over to the target and pointed to a little dent in the cardboard, which was all there was to show for any hit. With their rubber tips, the arrows just bounced off the target and fell harmlessly to the ground. "That's not mine. My dent should be on the nose," said Jeanne. "Not even close," said Skye. "We need something to put on the arrows so they'll leave a better mark where they hit," said Geoffrey. "Blood," said Skye. "Ketchup," said Geoffrey. "I'll get some ketchup while you take your turns," said Jeanne, and ran off. Long before Jeanne reached the cottage, she heard Hound barking. This wasn't odd in itself. Hound was always barking, but this was his "something is not right in my world" bark. Although Jeanne knew that could mean anything from a leaf had fallen in his water bowl to an elephant had walked into the yard, she hurried to his pen. Hound bounded over to her, barking even more furiously. Jeanne could see nothing wrong, however. His water and food bowl were full, he didn't look like he'd been hurt, and his pen looked the same as usual. Lots and lots of holes along the fence dug by Hound and filled in by Mr. Penderwick. "What's wrong, screwy dog?" she said. "Wow, woof, woof, wow," said Hound, crazily pawing at the gate. "Lonely, huh? Or Hound, but you've got to stay here. You wouldn't be good with arrows." Woof. Hound disagreed, but it wasn't arrows he was interested in. It was escape. He needed absolutely, positively, that very minute to get out of the pen and go help someone. If Batty had been there, she would have understood. But Batty wasn't, which was part of Hound's distress, and Jeanne wasn't as proficient as her little sister at dog language. "Sorry, buddy," she said. She hadn't gone half a dozen steps when she heard a big thump and a jubilant bark. She whipped around just in time to see Hound land on the wrong side of the fence and dash away. Hound was on the loose. It had long ago been proved that Hound could not be caught by one Penderwick sister alone. It took at least 2, and 3 was better, especially if one of them was Batty. Jeanne needed help. She sprinted back to Geoffrey and Skye, arriving just as Geoffrey was about to shoot another arrow at Dexter. "It's Hound," panted Jeanne. "He jumped over his fence and ran away." Geoffrey threw his bow and arrow to the ground. "Mother's been in and out of the gardens all day, fussing about her garden club competition. If she sees Hound, she'll go nuts. She still doesn't even know he's living here." The 3 took off for the tunnel at top speed, burst through the hedge, and ran smack into Rosalind. "Yaz is missing. I think Batty let him escape," said Rosalind wildly. "We have to find him before Cagney comes back." "And Hound's escaped from his pen," said Skye. There was dead silence as the full horror of the situation struck everyone. Then the 3 sisters started talking all at once. "Quiet!" Geoffrey shouted, waving his arms in the air. "Hound could be here any second. Skye, you guard the tunnel and keep him from coming through." "Right." She slipped back through the tunnel. "The rest of us will look for Yaz. I'll take from here to the pond," said Geoffrey. "I'll look in the flower beds along the hedge," said Jeanne. "And I'll look between here and the carriage house, in case he's sticking close to home," said Rosalind, desperately hoping that's what a rabbit would do. Geoffrey and Jeanne flew off. Rosalind turned and walked slowly back toward the carriage house, stooping to peer under every flower and leaf, around every urn and statue. The sun and shadows played tricks with her eyes. Over and again, dashes of white that she hoped were part of Yaz turned out to be flowers or stones. When at last she reached the final flower bed before the driveway, she was so discouraged she almost ignored one last white splatter. But when the splatter twitched in a most unflower-like way, Rosalind shaded her eyes from the sun, squinted, and breathed a tremendous sigh of relief. For there was Yaz, crouched calmly in a bed of nasturtiums, chomping on a leaf. "Oh, yes, thank goodness you're safe," Rosalind said. "Remember me and all those carrots my little sister and I gave you?" Yaz stopped chewing and tipped his head to one side. He seemed to be pondering the carrot memory and improving it. Rosalind almost believed he nodded before biting into another leaf. She dropped to her hands and knees and inched her way toward the renegade. Silently and smoothly she went forward, while Yaz cheerfully nibbled away, though always with one bright eye fixed on Rosalind. Rosalind felt that everything was now all right in the world. She was going to catch Yaz. She was very close now, a tiny bit more. It was just barely out of reach. And then a frenzied mixture of barking and shouting broke out behind Rosalind. "No!" she cried as Yaz stamped out one frenzied thump of danger and took off like a shot. Rosalind whipped around to see him zigzagging madly toward the lily pond. She knew only one creature fast enough to overtake the rabbit now, and unfortunately, that creature was about to do just that. Hound had obviously gotten past Skye and through the tunnel, for there he was, bolting through the gardens toward Yaz. Skye was tearing along behind him, and Jeanne and Geoffrey were racing from their different positions, trying to reach Hound before he caught Yaz. As if all that weren't awful enough, Rosalind heard yet another shout coming from a different direction, accompanied by the sound of high heels stomping on the asphalt driveway. "What's that dog doing in my gardens?" Marching toward Rosalind was a very angry Mrs. Tifton. As Rosalind watched, Mrs. Tifton tried to break into a trot, only to stumble, for one of her shoes had just lost a heel. This did not improve her temper. "Rosalind!" she screeched. With no time to be polite, Rosalind turned her back on Mrs. Tifton. She knew she was too far away to help Yaz. She could only stand and helplessly watch the wild chase toward the pond. Skye and Jeanne were far behind now, but Geoffrey was still in the game, running toward Hound in a last heroic attempt to cut him off. He made one magnificent dive in Hound's path, which Hound neatly sidestepped. 1, 2 horrible moments of silence. Then Jane's howl of anguish rang out across the gardens. There was only one thing that howl could mean. Rosalind started to cry. She hated to cry, but more she hated pain and suffering and death. She hated herself because she was going to have to tell Cagney that Hound had killed Yaz. Now here came poor stupid murderer Hound, galloping toward her with something brown and white in his mouth. Following him in a ragged line were Geoffrey, Skye, and Jeanne. And Mrs. Tifton was still approaching from the other direction, limping now, and muttering not very polite words. Rosalind wiped the tears from her eyes. She was the RAP. She could handle this. She stood firm and waited. Hound reached Rosalind with a happy bound and dropped Yaz at her feet. He barked. "Aren't I great? Aren't I wonderful?" Rosalind looked at him sternly, but hadn't the heart to scold. Seconds later, Geoffrey, Skye, and Jeanne arrived. Jeanne was sobbing. Skye grabbed hold of Hound's collar and held on like she had never let go again. Geoffrey, pale but alert, stepped in front of the little furry body on the ground, screening it from sight, just as Mrs. Tifton hobbled up to them. "Whose dog is this? Is this your dog?" Mrs. Tifton looked accusingly at Rosalind. "Yes, ma'am," said Rosalind. "I tell you to stay out of my gardens, and instead you bring your huge, disgusting dog over here to tear through my delphiniums. 3 days before the garden club competition? How dare you? No one even told me you had a dog." "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." I'm sorry, that's all you say. But you're right, it won't happen again. I'll be talking to your father about this, and about how all of you girls continually make free with my property." She turned to Jeanne. "What are you crying about, Skye?" "Nothing," said Jeanne, tears streaming down her face. Said Mrs. Tifton. "Come along back to the house, Geoffrey." "In a minute. Now, Dexter wants to give you some tips on your golf swing." "I'd like to help get Hound back to the cottage, Mother. It's important. I'll be home as soon as I do that." His mother stared witheringly at Geoffrey, but he had quite a stare of his own to give back. The Penderwicks didn't know which way it would go, but in the end it was Mrs. Tifton who dropped her eyes and chomped unevenly away, giving off almost visible fumes of rage. "We don't want you getting into trouble," said Rosalind to Geoffrey. "You didn't need to disobey." "Yes, I did. This is important." Geoffrey crouched down and gently stroked Yaz. There was no blood, thank heavens. "Should we bury him?" said Skye. "We have to wait for Cagney," said Rosalind. "Cagney!" said Jeanne, and cried harder. "We could at least put him in a box or something," said Skye. Geoffrey picked up the small body and cradled it to his chest. Rosalind, fighting back her tears, touched the darling bunny one last time. He was still warm. If she didn't know better, she'd think he wasn't dead. She could almost feel him breathing. "Oh!" shrieked Rosalind. "Look!" Everyone looked and shrieked too, for Yaz had opened his eyes. He looked as surprised as they were. "Is he alive?" cried Jeanne. "Is he okay?" cried Skye. Rosalind and Geoffrey felt Yaz all over and could find nothing wrong. "What? Hound didn't kill Yaz," said Geoffrey. "He caught him for us." Hound barked proudly. "Aren't I wonderful? Aren't I great?" And everyone who wasn't holding Yaz fell on Hound with cries of praise and delight. "Geoffrey, take Yaz back to Cagney's apartment," said Rosalind. "Right now, before anything else happens. We'll get Hound home and lock him up in the cottage." But Hound didn't like that idea. When Skye tugged on his collar to get him moving, he tugged in the other direction and started his something is not right barking all over again. "What's wrong with him now?" said Jeanne. "He already got to rescue Yaz." Hound's barking got worse. "Wow, wow, wow. What's he upset about?" said Geoffrey. "Can you understand him?" "Only Batty, really." Rosalind stopped and looked frantically around her. "Batty? Where's Batty?"